The year was 1789, and the French Revolution was in full swing. France was grappling with a severe food shortage and an economic crisis. Driven by hunger and poverty, the citizens demanded liberty, equality, and fraternity. They took matters into their own hands, overthrowing King Louis XVI and his 11,000 aristocrats. With the king dethroned, the enraged citizens turned their attention to the last remaining symbol of the old regime, Queen Marie Antoinette. In 1793, Marie Antoinette, who was captured by the revolutionaries, was sentenced to death by guillotine. People in the streets cheer after she is decapitated, with her head being displayed in triumph. In the crowd, an ambitious young Corsican army captain named Napoleon Bonaparte watched his queen getting executed. As he witnessed the act, a new ambition glowed in his eyes to rule France, a country that captured his beloved motherland, Corsica. This is the story of Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, an ambitious ruler, so much so that he didn't think twice before sacrificing his true love. Following this unrest, France formed a temporary government under the leadership of Maximilien Robespierre during the Reign of Terror in France. Trials were fought to determine the country's future. Napoleon witnessed it as a spectator. Later that year, Napoleon and his brother Lucien met the commissioner of the French army, Paul Barras, who tasked Napoleon with managing the siege of Toulon, a city long controlled by the British. Until then, no French general had been able to expel the British from the territory. Napoleon proposed a bold strategy. Rather than focusing on liberating the city, he suggested a direct assault on the British fort in the harbor, convinced that capturing the fort would compel the British to retreat. Paul Barras, impressed by Napoleon's insight, agreed to the plan. Upon arriving in Toulon, Napoleon assessed the fighting strength of the French troops. While preparations were underway, Napoleon disguised himself as an ordinary citizen to closely observe and analyze the weaknesses in the British defenses. To optimize their effectiveness, he modified the artillery to suit his preferred style of warfare. During the battle, his horse is hit by cannon fire, but he persists forward and defeats British forces on the field, blowing up their ships on the ocean. Thanks to his ingenious military tactics, the French forces could dismantle England's defenses in just one night. In recognition of this decisive victory, Paul Barras promoted Napoleon to brigadier general the very next day. After the Reign of Terror, which ended with the execution of Maximilien Robespierre, France was in chaos. Robespierre, who had failed in his attempt to escape, also made a failed attempt at suicide before being sentenced to the guillotine. With his death, the Reign of Terror came to a close, and over 40,000 prisoners were released. In the aftermath, French leaders, including Napoleon, sought to restore stability to the nation. With every success, Napoleon's objective became more clear, and ambition grew overnight. That year, Napoleon attends a ball in the summer where he first encounters Josephine de Beauharnais, an aristocratic widow. He was fascinated by her beauty and candor. At the party, Napoleon kept staring at her. But before they could strike up a conversation, Josephine couldn't care less and left the premises. Is that the end of a story? Or is there anything more to it? The day after Napoleon restored order, a young boy approached him with a request from his mother to retrieve his late father's sword. Napoleon handed him a random sword and decided to accompany the boy back to his home. There, he discovered that the boy was Josephine's son. This unexpected meeting marked the beginning of Napoleon's courtship with Josephine. As the revolutionary movement worsened that afternoon, Paul summoned Napoleon to discuss the situation. Paul explained that the government had only about 4,000 soldiers, while the revolutionary group had grown to 20,000. If they were attacked, they would likely be overwhelmed. Napoleon confidently assured Paul that the 4,000 troops were more than enough. He believed his strategic planning could successfully repel the revolutionary forces. The next day, the Second Revolution began. Around 20,000 people flooded the streets. Despite the overwhelming numbers, Napoleon was not afraid. He and his troops were prepared. His brilliant war strategy quickly dispersed the crowd, leading him to a decisive victory against the revolutionary group. During a conversation with Napoleon, Josephine revealed that she had 2 children, and her marriage had brought her great sadness because her husband was unfaithful and neglected their family. She also mentioned that she had been imprisoned for supporting King Louis XVI. Josephine expressed her concern that if their relationship became public, it might bring trouble for Napoleon. Despite her past, Napoleon looked beyond it and was determined to have a future with her. He promised to marry her, remain faithful, and provide the love and support she had missed throughout her life. After their marriage, Napoleon and Josephine sat across from each other with guests gathered around them during the dinner party. However, Napoleon was unhappy as he watched his newlywed wife chatting flirtatiously with Hippolyte Charles, a man much younger than her. However, he chose to ignore it. Days after the incident, life for Napoleon and Josephine seemed happy in their marriage. But later, Napoleon traveled to Egypt to fight in the Battle of the Pyramids. In 1798, Napoleon and his troops won a significant battle against Egypt. During his victory celebration, he received troubling news that, during his absence, Josephine had begun an affair with a soldier, Hippolyte Charles. Initially, Napoleon didn't believe it, but the thought persisted. After securing Egypt, Napoleon decided to return to France, against the advice of his right-hand man, who warned him that abandoning his mission could be considered treason. But Napoleon was too distressed to stay. The pain of possible betrayal weighed heavily on him during his journey back. When he arrived home and found Josephine wasn't there, so he impulsively ordered her belongings to be removed from their home. However, when Josephine returned and saw her things outside, she broke down and confessed that she was lonely, which led her to make a grave mistake. Napoleon, moved by her tears and honesty, forgave her. They reconciled, admitting their faults to each other. Napoleon realized his ambition had made him neglect his wife and promised to be more attentive. They realized that they were nothing without each other and that they were each other's strongest support. On the other hand, the French government and higher authorities were not pleased with Napoleon abandoning his troops. They criticized him severely, accusing him of betrayal despite his previous sacrifices for France. Napoleon, in return, blamed them for their ineffective leadership and challenged their authority. Feeling deeply betrayed by the harsh judgment of the country he had fought so hard for, Napoleon left the trial with a heavy heart. In response, his brother Louis suggested they seize power through a coup, believing that Napoleon's leadership could restore and lead France more effectively. Motivated by this belief in the opportunity to make a difference, they orchestrated the coup of 18 Brumaire. The coup was successful, overthrowing the existing government, and Napoleon was declared the first consul of France. However, his forceful foreign policies soon escalated conflicts with major powers like Britain, Russia, and Austria, setting the stage for further turmoil. As time passed, Napoleon dealt with foreign conflicts, particularly with England. Despite his advisors' warnings against sending a peace letter due to alliances between Britain, Russia, and Austria, Napoleon sent it anyway, hoping for peace. The British envoy mocked the peace offer, angering Napoleon, who vowed to stand his ground against any threats. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs suggested Napoleon to elevate his status to emperor to command more respect internationally. Napoleon accepted this advice and was crowned emperor after a lengthy process. Despite his new title, domestic issues loomed. The Minister of Foreign Affairs suggested Napoleon divorce Josephine if she could not produce an heir, arguing that a successor was crucial for a strong monarchy. This deeply hurt Josephine, straining their relationship further. Meanwhile, Napoleon watched as the allied Russian and Austrian armies positioned themselves against France. He prepared his defenses, setting a trap. As the enemy attacked, they fell into Napoleon's clever plans, leading them onto a frozen lake where he launched a devastating counterattack, securing a dramatic victory for France. Amidst all these, one thing that kept him going was his lovely wife back home, to whom he always wrote letters. After a triumphant victory on the battlefield, Napoleon returned to host a celebratory party at the palace. During the festivities, his mother introduced him to a woman she had chosen for him as part of her plan to ensure the continuation of his lineage. Josephine, unaware of the full extent of the situation, sensed the tension. The following day, Napoleon sought advice from his royal advisor. Initially, he considered claiming Josephine's son as his own to protect her dignity, but his advisor cautioned that if this lie gets revealed somehow, it would bring disgrace upon the nation. Reluctantly, and with a heavy heart, Napoleon disclosed everything to Josephine. The emotional toll was palpable as they both faced the reality that their marriage could not continue under the weight of political necessity. The next day, amidst the solemn eyes of France's officials, Napoleon and Josephine divorced. Despite the end of their marriage, their love never died, and they continued to exchange letters filled with warmth and affection. 2 years later, Napoleon, driven by his ambition to fortify France's position in Europe, married an Austrian princess. This alliance strengthened the bonds between France and Austria, and soon they welcomed a son. However, the geopolitical landscape remained fraught with tension. Russia, previously an ally, betrayed France by siding with Britain. In response, Napoleon led a vigorous campaign against Russia. The invasion was initially successful, but as they reached Moscow, they found the city deserted, and it was soon set on fire by the retreating Russian forces. Frustrated and enraged by this Russian tactic, Napoleon ordered an immediate advance on St. Petersburg, despite his troops' extreme cold and weariness. His insistence led to severe casualties without significant gains, and this ill-fated campaign forced Napoleon to retreat to France, where he faced harsh criticism and was stripped of his title and exiled to Elba. During his exile, Napoleon pondered over his actions, realizing that his relentless pursuit of glory had caused immense suffering. After 300 days determined to make amends, he escaped from Elba and returned to France. His troops, once seeing their former leader, rallied behind him, filled with renewed hope. But upon reaching Josephine's residence, Napoleon was devastated to learn she had passed away a month earlier from diphtheria. To overcome grief, he mourned the loss of his great love, regretting that his quest for power had ultimately cost him the chance to reconcile with Josephine. This tale of Napoleon and Josephine ends not on battlefields or thrones, but with the poignant silence of unspoken apologies and the quiet grief of a man who gained the world but lost his heart. Napoleon was yet to face his ultimate challenge at the Battle of Waterloo in June 1815. Despite rallying his troops against the British army led by the Duke of Wellington, his strategies failed. The French cavalry's charges were repelled by British infantry formations. And even with Napoleon's desperate calls for advancement, the reformed enemy lines stood firm. The arrival of Prussian Marshal Blucher's forces tipped the scale, leading to a crushing defeat for the French. Subsequently, Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean. Far from the battlefields and the glory of his past, Napoleon spent his days interacting with local children and drafting memoirs that portrayed a version of history in which he was the perennial hero. Despite his attempts to shape his legacy, his health declined. In his final days, isolated and ailing, Napoleon's thoughts frequently turned to Josephine. He imagined conversations with her, hearing her voice calling him to join her beyond this life. These visions were both a comfort and a poignant reminder of his deep love and his profound loneliness without her. Napoleon passed away in 1821, his last words reflecting his life's passions: France, army, Josephine. His mind lingered on the country he loved, the soldiers he led, and the woman who had captured his heart. The narrative of his life is marked by 61 battles, the loss of nearly 3 million soldiers under his command, and the enduring story of his love for Josephine, a tale of ambition intertwined with tender, unfulfilled desires.